Welcome to this PIR live event um, featuring Dr. Brian Dixon from the University of Waterloo. Dr. Dixon is the Canada Research Chair in Fish and Environmental Immunology, in addition to his duties at the University of Waterloo. We're going to discuss aquaculture today. Before we get started, I have reminded a few people already to please open your Q&A window, and we'll use that for submitting questions that will get relayed to Dr. Dixon through the webinar today. Will be about 30 minutes in total. I am going to ask Dr. Dixon to start his video and unmute him. So welcome, Brian. Thank you for your time today. I'll give you a minute to introduce yourself, and then we can get going.
Okay, sure. So my name is Brian Dixon. I'm a professor in the biology department at the University of Waterloo. I also have the privilege of being the Canada Research Chair in Fish and Environmental Immunology. It means I have expertise and I have a title. I studied at many Canadian universities. I did my bachelor's degree at the University of, Wilfrid Laurier University, my master's at the University of Guelph, my PhD at Dalhousie, where I actually started on working on fish immunology. I did a postdoctoral fellowship in Wageningen in the Netherlands. There'll be bonus points later for pronouncing that. And I also did a postdoctoral fellowship at Stanford University. I've been at the University of Waterloo for about 20 years now.
That's fabulous, Brian. Now, we had a couple of slides that you wanted to start with, and sure. I'll let you get those shared.
Yep. Okay. There we go. Okay.
Fabulous.
Good. So I wanted to talk a little bit about aquaculture. I work on, as you may have guessed, fish immunology, which means the health of fishes, how they resist diseases and control parasites and other problems that they may have, just like we have with our health. The particular focus of my work is aquaculture because that's one of the main industries that involves fish health. I do a little bit of work on wild fish, but aquaculture is the most important. I want to show you with this graph how important it is. So this graph shows you the tons. You can see on the left there, millions of tons of fish that we gather for food for human beings, and the proportion that comes from capturing them in nets, fishing in the ocean, and the proportion that comes from aquaculture. Now, what's important to note is two things I would point out to you. One is that if you look at the end, that's 2015, you can see that nearly 50% of the food that the world eats, the fish food that the world eats, comes from aquaculture. In fact, in 2018, that proportion went over 50%. So if the world wants to eat food, aquaculture is the way to do it, right? We really need aquaculture. And the reason for that is if you look at the orange part of the graph, you can see that from the 1950s up to about 1990, there was a growth in the number of fish that we captured from the ocean. Right around 1990, that amount that we catch peaked. We do not catch any more fish now from the ocean than we did 30 years ago. So if the world wants to eat more fish, and if it's a very healthy food, we're not going to get it by capturing fish from the ocean. And I think a lot of people would say they'd rather eat wild fish than aquaculture fish. But if you think about this graph, unless you know that you're eating from a fishery that is sustainable, the stocks will replenish themselves if you fish it out, then you are not really being as environmentally friendly as you think. You might be eating fish from a fishery that's in decline, and you might be contributing to the declines of wild stocks of fish, right? So that's one thing. Aquaculture gets a bad rap, but it's absolutely necessary if we're going to eat fish in the future. Okay. And the second thing I want to talk about is the implications about aquaculture fish and fish health and some of the things that I work on. So one of the big projects I'm working on right now is ways to make fish healthy without using antibiotics. So for those of you who are not familiar with them, antibiotics are drugs that kill bacteria. So they're very good for bacterial disease. If you get, for example, pneumonia in your lungs, it's a bacterial disease, the doctor will likely prescribe you antibiotics. One of the biggest problems we have in the modern world is we don't have many new antibiotics, and a lot of the bacteria out there have been exposed to them for so long that they're resistant. So antibiotic resistance is a big problem. In aquaculture and indeed in agriculture, so for chickens and pigs as well as fish, we do use antibiotics to treat diseases. And I'll show you this next graph if I can. Right? This is antibiotic use in aquaculture. And this goes back to about 1985. And you can see back in the late 80s, 1990s, Norway was the main country in the world that was producing Atlantic salmon for aquaculture. And you can see they had a large amount, that's antibiotic use, grams per ton of fish produced. So you can see they were using a lot of antibiotics to treat diseases. Now, after that, Norway decided to do a lot of breeding programs to get healthier fish and families of fish that would survive well. And we came up with some vaccines. So we reduced the amount going there. The problem is the vaccines don't work terrifically well, and especially for new diseases. So you can see Norway was the dominant player in aquaculture for many years. Other countries have got into the game now. And so you can see now around 2008 there, you can see Chile, you can see Ireland, Canada, and the UK. And you can see we use antibiotics. Chile by far uses a lot of antibiotics. They have grown Atlantic salmon in the Southern Pacific, and there's diseases there that are novel and don't respond well to antibiotics. So they use a fair bit of antibiotics. Canada, last year in 2018, put about 150 tons of antibiotics into the ocean. So that will invariably get released. Some of it will get released, and you'll get antimicrobial resistant, you'll get antibiotic resistant bacteria that will cause diseases for fish and humans. So a lot of what I work on is either breeding fish to make sure that they're healthy naturally. I work on understanding how fish immune responses work so we can develop better vaccines. And I work on replacements for antibiotics. So as I mentioned, one of the big projects I'm working on now involves collaborating with Cuba to work on natural treatments, taking molecules from the fish immune system that are natural, that are part of their defense, and using them as a drug treatment to replace antibiotics. It's a more natural system. There'll be less resistance arising in the bacteria in the wild, right? And it's a way of fixing things. And in places like Cuba, which are not on this graph, and Africa, the global south, they don't just add the antibiotics when the fish get sick, they feed it to them all the time. So there's a large amount, tons and tons of antibiotic going to the environment. So that's one issue we've got to fix with aquaculture, right? I think that's one of the main things I want to talk about. There are other issues, environmental issues. They're not as serious as people might think. The one that in BC that people often get upset about is transmittance of diseases from aquaculture fish to wild fish. The evidence for that is much slimmer than you might think. They can show that the wild fish may have a similar pathogen to the aquaculture fish, but whether it's being passed from the aquaculture fish to the wild fish or the other way around has not been clearly established. The aquaculture fish are vaccinated, so they should contain less of the disease in the first place. And one fascinating fact from research I did in collaboration here with Dr. Nils Bols, another professor in the biology department, is you can take a fish virus, stick it to a piece of plastic, and keep it wet, and that virus will be able to infect another fish for up to 30 days. So if you think about in the ocean, and there are places in the ocean where the currents are 1 meter per second, so that in 30 days, that piece of plastic with a virus could go tens to hundreds of kilometers. So one fish getting another fish sick might not even involve them being anywhere near to each other. So there's a lot of complicated factors out there about what's going with aquaculture. It's a fairly good food source, and it's a fairly natural way of growing animals if you compare it to things like the way we grow chickens and pigs. So I think it's a good industry. I'm working hard to solve problems. Yeah. I just wanted to put up at the end, there's a picture of me with a Chinook salmon I was spawning about 2 weeks ago in BC. I wanted to put my email up there. So even after the PR event, if you want to email me and ask me questions, I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about aquaculture, fish health, and those kind of things.
Thanks, Brian. If you can just click the stop share button.
Okay, good. Yeah.
Fabulous. So we did have a question in the Q&A that we'll get to right now, and then we'll talk about a couple other things.
Yeah.
The question is about genetically modified Atlantic salmon.
Okay.
Is it used in any of the ocean fish farms?
No, actually, so I know a little bit about this. My wife actually grew the first generation of those genetically modified salmon. So,
Really?
yes, so they are not used in ocean net fish farms. They were licensed for use uh, to be grown in PEI and in Panama, but they have to be grown in land-based facilities. So it's a big warehouse with recirculated water. And actually, it's partly so they can't be released in the environment. But interestingly, those fish also have to be treated so they're sterile, and they have to be treated so they're all female. They hormonally treat them in order to reduce the risk of them getting out into the wild and breeding with wild fish. So they are used. They are actually sold in the Canadian market. They're not labeled as transgenic, but they're not used in open net pens.
So that brings up a question that I had, not being that familiar with aquaculture per se. I know that you and I talked a little bit about an interest in the Canadian government moving to inland fish farming, particularly in BC. Can you tell us a little bit about the differences, the challenges between ocean-based aquaculture and inland?
So let me start with ocean-based aquaculture. If the farm is sited correctly, so the particular fish I showed you there is from a fish farm that's in BC, very close to a place called Seymour Narrows, so halfway up Vancouver Island. It's a place where the tides that come around the south end of Vancouver Island and the north end of Vancouver Island meet. And so the tides are very high there, and there's a lot of flushing. The water goes in and out and in and out. And if a fish farm is sited in such a place, the waste products, the fish feces, the poop, gets washed away, and the environment around the fish farm is actually very clean. There's seals, there's seabirds, there's all kinds of marine invertebrates, because all of the waste is removed and diluted in the ocean. So that's one of the reasons why they put fish in net pens in the first place. A, they need the salt water, but B, they want the dilution effect of the whole ocean. The problems you get with fish farms is when you go large scale, sometimes if you have like 10 million fish on a site, if it's not sited correctly and it does not flush appropriately, you can get problems with waste products gathering on the bottom and making the bottom of the ocean anoxic and environmental problems. They have, for the most part, fixed most of that, but there are still some issues with that. The conversation we had regarding the Liberals in the last election promised to move aquaculture in BC, not on the East Coast, only in BC, into land-based systems. And actually, when I was at the fish farm a couple of weeks ago, I was working on Chinook salmon, and it turned out it doesn't apply to the Chinook salmon on the West Coast. It only applies to the Atlantic salmon, right? Now, the issues with that are, there's several. And the problem is, I think the technology is not there yet for us to do it. Most of the fish farms are in the ocean because you need salt water. If you were to move it onto a land-based system, you would still need salt water to grow the fish in the salt water part of their life cycle. So you're going to have to take water from the ocean. It's pretty much impossible to artificially dilute salts into water for 10 million salmon. You're just not going to be able to do it. So you're going to have a pipe that sucks the water up from the ocean. It's going to recirculate in this great big facility. And generally they replace about 5% of the water a day to flush some of the waste and the buildup dissolved in the water out back into the ocean. Now, the problems are, it's very, very hard to filter the water coming in. So for bacteria in the lab, we push the water through a filter that is 0.2 micron pores. Now, that's very, very tiny. And if you were to try and push the volume of water you needed for 10 million salmon through those pores, it would take a lot of pressure, and it would probably break the filter. In addition, you're sucking seawater, so there's going to be twigs. It's going to be clogging up very quickly. Even if you could do that and filter out the bacteria, viruses will fit through that. Viruses are very submicroscopic almost, and there are 10 to the 6 to 10 to the 7. That's 1 million to 10 million viruses per ml of seawater. Not all of them are pathogenic, but they're in there. And then what will happen is they will get sucked into this land-based facility, and then they will circulate around because 90% of the water is recirculated, 95%, and they'll just keep reinfecting the fish. So if they get a disease in there, all they would have to do they'd have to basically get rid of the 10 million fish, bleach out the whole system in the hope that you're killing all the bacteria and viruses, and try again, right? So, and the other consequences if you do get a disease in there. You've got 10 million salmon that are affected, and all of that outflow will be going out of one pipe into one site in the middle of the ocean, right? Because you still have to vet some of the water. So I think until they can figure out a way to treat the water coming in and going out in an efficient way, it's going to be a problem. We do have technology for doing it. One of the things they use is UV light. So you run the water through UV lights, which sterilizes things. The problem is if the water is at all cloudy, or if there's any kind of junk in the water, it does not sterilize. One of the other systems they use for fresh water is they put ozone in the water, and it works well for fresh water, but for salt water, it produces toxic bromides that will kill the fish and probably the humans there. So technology is not quite there yet. They do a lot of the freshwater phase of growing the fish in such facilities. I've worked in a facility in Chile that produces 14 million salmon a year to put into net pens in the freshwater phase that runs like that. But the whole life cycle, it will be difficult. So,
wow.
Yeah.
It sounds like we're a ways away.
Yeah, we are.
Despite the promises. Ms. Lowe's grade 7 students had a question asking, do fish have an adaptive immune response? And if not, how do the vaccines work?
So fish do have an adaptive immune response, although I'll qualify that with an interesting example in a minute. They have almost all the same immune cells and molecules that we have. They make antibodies. They have the phagocytic cells that engulf things and start immune responses. Yes, they have adaptive immune responses. Their adaptive immune responses are not the same as ours. So when we get vaccinated because our immune response will remember that vaccination and will respond later, in our case, decades later. Fish don't do that. The fish that we work on, mostly salmon, only live 4 to 7 years. So you vaccinate them once and they will have an immune response, but it lasts almost their whole life and then goes away. So their adaptive system is not the same as ours and does not get better or stronger the way ours does. So the vaccines work, they just don't work very well. And I think one of the problems is that with the innate immune system. So the innate immune system is what the part that responds quickly and decides, we've got a bacteria here, we've got a virus here, we've got a parasite here, and tells the adaptive system what to do. Vaccines that we use in fish are based on vaccines that we use in humans and agricultural animals, mammals. I think fish immune systems recognize different parts of the bacteria and virus than we do. So the vaccines that we make that work for us don't quite work for them.
Excellent.
Now, the interesting example, Brent, I will give you is fish are very, very, very diverse. So for those of you who know anything about evolutionary history, mice and humans diverged about 80 million years ago. We were all little small mammals back then, and we evolved from there. Fish, salmon, carp, cod, diverged at the earliest 150 million years ago, sometimes 200, 250 million years ago. They are very, very different. So a fascinating fact is cod, who live on the East Coast, don't really have an adaptive immune system. For some reason, they have lost all the genes to make antibodies better, to start antibody responses. They rely entirely on innate immune responses. However, it never stopped them because before we fished them out, there was billions of cod in the ocean, but they don't have an adaptive immune response.
Thank you. Ms. Tanner's grade 5 students want to know what type of vaccines the fish are given.
They're given several different types of vaccines. One of the problems in developing vaccines for fish is, like, as I said, one particular site will have 10 million fish. And the profit margin on fish is not very much. So if we're going to vaccinate fish, the vaccines can't be too fancy, super technological, because it becomes too expensive. If it's $1 per fish, that's 10 million fish. That's $10 million to vaccinate the fish. They're not going to make that much money. So the vaccines tend to be very simple vaccines. They're called autologous vaccines, or probably what you might call live inactivated vaccines. They take the bacteria that's infecting the fish, they grow it up, they kill it with heat or sometimes formalin, and inject it back in the fish. There are a couple of recombinant vaccines, kind of like the flu shot, where they take a particular protein from a bacteria or a virus, and they grow it separately in a flask with the bacteria, and then they just put that protein in the fish. They're not super effective and they're expensive. But mostly it's autologous vaccines.
Excellent. I'm going to get the name probably wrong. Mr. Peichel's class
Yeah.
asking what are the environmental and economic implications of aquaculture? That sounds like about a 4-hour
Oh,
lecture answer, but maybe you can do that in a couple of minutes.
I will try. I feel like my answers have been long already. So the environmental economic impacts. So the environmental impacts are the problems that people worry about are the fish escaping and interfering with the wild fish. So quite often, if the fish escape, they will try and swim up the river and compete with the wild fish for spawning grounds. The fish that have been grown in aquaculture have been bred for aquaculture, so they're genetically less diverse, and they're worried there'll be less genetic diversity in the wild fish. Um, in BC, as far as Atlantic salmon, there's been no real documented case of Atlantic salmon escaping and swimming up the rivers and displacing the wild fish. And if you think about it, Atlantic salmon compared to, say, a big Chinook, like a 30-kilogram Chinook, Atlantic salmon are small. They're not likely to outcompete the Chinook salmon. They are concerned about the wild fish. Economically, the fishery out in BC is a lot less than of an economic output than aquaculture. Aquaculture now is, in BC alone, is $1 billion a year industry. It actually, I was told when I was out there, it's now their biggest export. So the fishery going out capturing fish is getting less and less. So the economic input there is a problem. It's an environmental problem.
Excellent. Ms. Van Kempen McClinton's class had a follow-up question that was on my mind as well. How do you go about injecting 10 million fish?
Well, and that's interesting. And again, it gets back to how effective the vaccines are. There are several ways of doing it. The best and most effective way is to inject them with, like they inject us in the army, you inject them in the belly, right? But if you can imagine, for 10 million fish, it's quite the process. But that facility I was at in Chile that produces 14 million salmon a year, they had a very sophisticated sort of conveyor belt system. They had tubes, and they sucked the small fish through the tubes to a place where they go into a big bath of anesthetic, and they sort of knock the fish out, make them numb. And then you have like 10 people, and they pick up a fish, they inject it with this auto injector that's almost on an IV drip, and they inject them. Now, the downside of that is it's very stressful on the fish. And just by vaccinating them, you might lose 2 to 3% of the fish, just stressing out doing that. We're working on other ways of vaccinating fish. One of the ways that they also try is called bath vaccination. So they put the vaccine in a tub of water, and they dip the fish in. The whole thinking on that is the fish have gills. So it's like our lungs, but on the outside. And 30% of the surface area of the fish is in those gills, right? And they're one cell layer thick, so they absorb things. So they try and do that, and that is also relatively expensive, because you can imagine if you've got to do 10 million fish and you've got a tub, you've got to put a lot of vaccine in the water. It's also not as effective as injecting them, because you can't control how much they absorb across their gills. And some of the fish will absorb more, some will absorb less, and it does not work effectively. So they do bath vaccination, they do injection vaccination. They have their advantages and disadvantages. The holy grail, and what everyone is working on, is to do it in their food. So we have some human vaccines, particularly for gut infections, where you can take it in your food. We're working on doing that. Now, the problem is it's a complicated process where you have to get the feed coated with your vaccine. The fish have to eat it. It has to go through their stomach, which is pH 2, back to their intestine, which is pH 7. And then you have to get the vaccine to go from their stomach inside their body. So there's a lot of chemistry involved there. I'm actually working with some nanotech engineers, who are actually in the building just beside me here, who are actually helping me work on encapsulation technologies to coat the feed with little oil-based capsules that contain things like that, and then contain specific compounds to enhance transferring it across the gut to make oral vaccines. But technology is not there yet.
Excellent. Okay, another question that's probably a 4-hour lecture. Ms. Lowe's class is asking, is fish farming ethical?
Well, that's a yes. Okay. Is it ethical? Well, it is a way to produce food. And I think, as I showed you in the beginning, it is now become a very important food source for most of the world. Capture fisheries are declining. So if you want to be ethical and capture fish from the ocean, we're likely going to fish them all out, and they're going to go extinct. So I think as opposed to destroying wild stocks, keeping them in net pens and breeding them specifically is a more ethical way to go. I would put the question back to them. Is chicken farming ethical? Is pig farming ethical? Is culturing cows ethical? I think ethical arguments are interesting, but we also need to eat.
Yeah, that's a challenge. And you brought up the issue that aquaculture can strive to deal with, and that's the outfishing of natural stocks. And you talked about cod earlier. Are Canadian fisheries at risk of losing other natural species right now?
Yes. So I worked on the cod fishery actually during my PhD. So I was there at the end of my PhD. They closed the cod fishery and it has not recovered at all. So there's a few inland fisheries open, but it's not back. On the West Coast, they're having trouble right now with the Chinook wild fishery. So and one of the problems there is that there's you've probably heard about it in the news. There's a group of killer whales called the Southern Resident Killer Whales. They live off Victoria at the south end of Vancouver Island, and they eat exclusively Chinook salmon. The problem is the Chinook salmon returns are abysmal. So the BC government has this program called the Salmon Enhancement Program. They take the salmon that swim up the rivers, they spawn them the same way I would in the fish on the aquaculture farm, and then they release them back in the ocean to go out and swim away, and then they're supposed to come back probably 4 to 5 years later and spawn in the rivers again. On the way back, there's supposed to be a large food source for these killer whales. They put millions of fish, Chinook salmon into the ocean every year, and the return rate is 0.4%. So now the natural return rate on a wild fishery might only be 10%. There's a reason why fish lay 3,000 to 10,000 eggs, is they go into the ocean and they get eaten by sharks or seals, or they get, there's environmental problems and they die because there's no food. So the return rate is small anyway, but for the Chinook salmon fishery in particular, it's very low and they don't know why. They're actually starting a DFO, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, is going to start an expedition to go out and sail around the Pacific Ocean next year to follow the Chinook salmon and see where they go and why they're dying. So yes, wild fisheries are still a problem in Canada.
Okay. A couple other questions that we'll try and get to before we get too far over time. Mr. Peichel's class, I'll try and combine this couple of questions. Can you talk a little bit about the aquaculture food chain and whether the waste from aquaculture can be used for growing other food?
Actually, so the waste from aquaculture has been used for several things. Basically, it's the heads and the skeletons and the internal organs. Quite often it is used for fertilizer because it's fairly good fertilizer. There was a company on the East Coast that was taking the skeletons and removing things like chitosan and other natural products. So there are a couple of moves to take the waste products from aquaculture and use them for other things. They do grind them up and use them for fish oils as well. So.
Okay. And Ms. Tanner's grade 5s also wanted to ask, on average, how many fish can be bred at one time?
Well, quite a lot. So let me give you an example. I was out in BC just for a research project 3 weeks ago. I stayed for a week and we bred 27 males and 27 females. But if you think each female produced 3,000 eggs, we produced, well, it was 900,000 eggs. So a lot of eggs, right? So, and when they do it commercially, they do hundreds of fish. So they produce millions of fish in the form of eggs all the time. And then they grow them up. And as I said, the facility in Chile that I worked in bred 20 million eggs to have 14 million salmon go out into the net pens. So, and they do that all at once at one time a year.
So a bit of a follow-up question on that. How is that breeding process done?
So because the fish that we work on, Chinook salmon, naturally die at the end of the spawning cycle, they swim up the river, we take them and we euthanize them so that they're dead already. And then basically, this may sound crude, please excuse me, but you take the males and you squeeze them and the sperm comes out and you gather it in a little cup. You take the females and because they're dead, you cut them open. You can squeeze them as well. You gather the eggs in another cup and then you just mix the two. And literally I stir it with my finger. You wait about a minute for the fertilization to occur. You add fresh water because the fresh water finishes the process and what we call hardens the eggs. We then put them in a, a little facility. I should have got a picture for you, but a little thing called a heath tray. It's just a set of trays with slots in, and fresh water trickles down, and they sit in those trays mimicking a freshwater stream for about 5 months. So we spawned them last week. In about February or March, the eggs will hatch and they will swim up. You gather them, you put them in small tanks, and then you just keep feeding them until about July, August, and then you take them, and that's about the time of year when they would go out to the ocean, and you put them in net pens, and then you grow them for 3 years. Atlantic salmon these days, they might only keep them 2 years, and then they harvest them for market.
Excellent. Another interesting question, asking if bioaccumulation, is that an issue with immunization in aquaculture?
Well, bioaccumulation is the buildup of toxins through the food chain. So that would be invertebrates gather up things like pollutants from the environment, and then the small fish will eat several invertebrates, and they will get a bigger dose, and bigger fish will eat them, and you get a bigger dose and a bigger dose. So it's not a problem in aquaculture because we feed them feed pellets, much like you'd feed your dog or your cat. And they're very careful about sourcing the materials that go in there. There is some wild fish in there because wild salmon eat fish, but it's all very carefully sourced and checked to make sure there's no contaminants in there.
Excellent. Ms. Tanner's class is going to get the joy of the last question of the day, and it actually works with one that I like to always ask at the end. They want to ask about the salary for someone who works in aquaculture, and then additionally, what kind of schooling do you need?
It depends what part of aquaculture you're in, but if you're actually working out on the net pens, it's probably very close to Canadian average salary. It's probably about $40,000 a year. It's not a very high margin business, so they don't make a lot of money for every fish. So the education you need, there are colleges where you can do a 2-year college degree in aquaculture. There are also bachelor's degrees out on the East Coast, bachelors of aquaculture and masters of aquaculture, things like the Marine Institute in Newfoundland does. So you can have various level of degrees to do it, but also that would dictate the level you are. So you might be someone who works in the net pens feeding the fish. You might be the farm manager, someone who actually manages the people, is out on the net pens, but also does the economics and the selling and those things. So there's various levels of education you can get.
And then I'll throw in one more along that line for myself. How does somebody like yourself get to be a researcher working with fish and immunology? What does that education trajectory look like?
Oh, okay. Well, so I wanted to be a professor. So I did a bachelor's degree, and I thought the professors had a lot of fun. And to be fair, I do. I'm going to Chile in a few weeks. I work in Panama. I worked in Australia. So as opposed to my colleagues who work on human immunology, they work with mice in the lab and they never go anywhere. So I have a lot of fun. Anyway, I did a bachelor's degree. That was 4 years. I did a master's degree, which took me 2.5 to 3 years. Then I did a PhD, which took me another 3 years. So it's 10 years of university. To be a professor, you also have to do sort of apprenticeships called postdoctoral fellowships, where you work with a professor, but you're kind of working on your own. And I did one for 2 years in Wageningen, as I mentioned, in the Netherlands. And I did another one for 2.5 years in Stanford. So for me, it was about 15 years of university and post-university training. You can do it in less. Sometimes there's only 2 years of post-university training. The reason I got into fish immunology was I was interested in immunology. And during my PhD, I actually worked on seal immunology. The cod project was working on a worm that infects cod that breeds in the stomach of seals. I worked on human immunology, and I worked on fish immunology. And I decided that I liked fish immunology the best. Humans were expensive to keep. The fish immunology at the time, and this was 30 years ago, I realized that Canada was going to have a big aquaculture sector, and we would probably need fish immunologists. And it paid off. Now, I'm a fish immunologist, and the aquaculture sector works with me. It only took 25 years.
Yeah, just overnight success.
Yes.
Well, we're a bit over time already, so we'll have to end it there. Thank you so much, Brian. Always appreciate your time and your insights into biology and fish and the environment. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay. No, thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
Great. To our attendees, I'll just let you know that our next PIR live event is November 18th at 1 o'clock Eastern time, where we'll be joined by Dr. Myra Hurd from Queen's University and lead researcher on the Canada Waste Flow Project. We'll be talking about waste in Canada, recycling programs in Canada and internationally. Lots of interesting topics there. So again, thank you for joining us today. Hope you can join us on the 18th and take care. Bye for now.